You are listening to the Accents podcast on WUKY. I am your host, Katerina Stoykova. This episode has been brought to you by Kentucky Humanities and the Kentucky Book Festival. My guest today is poet Pauletta Hansel. So good to have you here with me, Pauletta. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Katerina. I'm so happy to be here.
Your new book is out, Will There Also Be Singing? It's your 10th poetry collection. It's a book of witness and protest, giving voice to people whose lives you understand better than most. And also, this is a book aiming to explore some of the current racial, political, and class issues that we've inherited and that we grapple with in the present. It is a complex and ambitious book.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm very happy to be here talking about this book. These are poems that have been written mostly over the last 8 to 6 years, I would say, a few perhaps a little bit longer, but beginning in 2016 with the last election and election season, and then moving into the pandemic years. Mostly bringing material from the outside in. You know, I often talk about my work as being part of the movement of the personal is political, believing that telling the truth about lives that aren't always spoken in media, women's lives, Appalachian lives, people who are not perhaps always within the mainstream is in and of itself a political act. But with this particular book, I feel that that's reversed in that the political, the much more explicitly political and social context is very personal to my life. And so as opposed to looking inward, I'm taking the inner voice and the inner concerns and looking outward.
I was struck by the expression writing from outside in. That's exactly what you said, right?
Mm-hmm, I think so.
Say more about that.
These poems, to a large degree, were inspired by text external to me and to my life. And so they come from newspaper articles that I've read. One, a longer sort of suite of poem, or one longer poem that is in the center of the book is actually in response to an essay in a book called Race in the City, which is about Cincinnati. But it is about a young African-American man who moved from eastern Kentucky to Cincinnati in the 1920s, or in the late 19 teens, but worked as a social worker and teacher and organizer and advocate in Cincinnati mostly in the 1920s. And so I had been given an assignment by Saad Ghosn, who is a poet and activist in Cincinnati, to choose a chapter of that particular book to write about, and I chose this poem, or this chapter about James Hathaway Robinson to write about, because I saw both the similarities and the differences in our lives. I'm a white Appalachian woman who came to Cincinnati in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and have much more privilege, even as an Appalachian woman, of course, than James Hathaway Robinson did as an African-American man, and am able to see so many of the issues that he was grappling with in the early part of that century are still true in the early part of this century. So just a selection of interests, but brought to me from looking outward into the political climate today.
Why don't you read us anything from the book, whatever you feel is appropriate?
This poem is called President's Day 2021. 1. Friend, I can't stop thinking about race today. And by race, I mean whiteness, mine and yours. And if I am honest, I am trying to be honest, that of almost everyone I know. The neighborhood is getting whiter, and I'm not talking about the February snow that coats our cars and lawns and sidewalks. 15 years ago, we were the nice white couple next door, across the street, backyard abutting yard. Now there's too many of us for me to count. Our Black Lives Matter signs are staked in lawns where black children played. My husband's children called these tree-lined cul-de-sacs the ghetto. I'd like to say we moved here then to give his suburban teens a better view. In truth, we moved here for those trees, this house, the yard, the picture of the kind of whiteness we might learn to be. But mixed neighborhoods don't mean we don't still sort ourselves by color, like to like. 2. Today I walk the snow-packed streets, composing in my mind these lines I'll write to you. I am careful where I put my foot. This whiteness covers ice and cracks I cannot see. The scarf that's wrapped around my neck, gold-flecked black against the cardinal red of my down coat, was given to me by black women I love. Their hands eased my mother's pain. Their faces eased my memory of her years of dying. We hold her close by keeping each other near. And still, we are so careful. We watch where we step. 3. Do you remember where you were 2008 election day, Barack Obama? Of course you do. In this room where I now write, I watched his victory speech recorded on the internet. Michelle dressed in red on black, starlight beside him. I cheered my silent cheers while my stepdaughter slept. I'd taken her to see some fluff of white girls whining on the movie screen. I tried to fill and smooth the cracks between us then. Now she bemoans all the ways her family raised her to be racist. As we did. As we all were raised, we who are white. 4. I know I told you of my father's March for Justice, Main Street, Richmond, Kentucky, May 1961. White stones thrown against our house. I probably never shared the story my parents told me, how at 5 years old I tried to talk away their tears during Walter Cronkite 1965, the bloody march from Selma to Montgomery. It's okay, I told them. They're only black. 5. I wear my whiteness lightly, like a down-filled coat. I hardly know it's there unless I'm called out to the cold without it. And friend, how often am I called to that?
I think this is extraordinarily brave poem and vulnerable too.
I have to say that yes, I cringe, especially with the story of my 5-year-old self, pulling from whatever, social and political and context, national context, how would I have possibly thought that the color of people's skin made a difference in such a horrific time? And my parents were horrified. I don't remember it, but I remember the story, and I've always held it with me as learning tool for myself, that it's so difficult to escape the inherent racism in this country, and I am clearly not immune, no matter my good intentions.
I admire that poem, the voice, the introspection, the craft, the power, the responsibility taken, the issues exposed. What do your African American friends say about this poem and the book?
Mhm. We haven't had much conversation about it, actually. That the book is so new at this point that I've read it to very few crowds of people. I certainly, the poem had been written and published earlier, and I have had one conversation with an African American friend who is also a poet and a storyteller. And I mean, clearly she's taken aback by it and saying that she's glad she didn't, feeling that she's glad she didn't know me then. And I can certainly understand that. But, I think that we have to acknowledge our own place in the problem. Before we can do anything about ourselves, we have to acknowledge it, and before we can do anything about the problems facing our country, we have to be able to make corrections within ourselves as well.
I don't know anything more innocent than a 5-year-old girl,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know anything more honorable than the older woman pointing out and telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is I admire you.
Thank you, Katerina. This poem was written as part of an epistolary exchange between a very close friend who was also in her own life and in her own town in Asheville, North Carolina, grappling with issues of race in some ways in much more direct ways than I was. And so the level of vulnerability in the poem, I think, comes from the level of safeness in the initial drafting of the poem and knowing who would hear it and who would hold it initially. There's also, within my own history as a writer, and I think probably Katerina and I have perhaps talked about this as we've talked in many times past, that I had a long period of silence in my life as a poet, where I had, as a very young woman, as a teenager actually, and young woman, had written quite prolifically and had even published in a number of journals, including an article in Ms. Magazine on Appalachian women writers in the mid-70s. And then for a period of time in my 20s and early 30s, I just stopped writing and was not able to begin writing again until I first came to a safe place of writers, and then within myself decided that what I had to do if I was going to continue to write was to tell the truth about my life and myself, because I came to believe that my silence to a large degree was based on not being willing as a writer willing as a person, much less as a writer, to go to those places of vulnerability and self-knowledge, and it completely shut me down for more than a decade. So, what in a sense might seem like bravery feels like self-preservation, because my period of not writing was also a period of much unhappiness in my life, because everything was being kind of held in and shut down, and my true my true ability to live and thrive was not I was not granting it to myself. So I just tell that story, which was much more about my own personal truths as a girl and as a woman than the larger societal truths, but I tell it within this context because I feel as if I have the obligation to myself, at least, to be honest.
And in this book, you have poems that address America. Speak about those, please.
So these poems. Many of them were in fact written after the last election in 2016, when it was hard to believe um, what was happening on the national stage. I think we've gotten a little bit more hardened to it now, but I still, it still feels, there still is a sense of unreality.
Disbelief.
Yes, disbelief, disbelief, and sure. In fact, in one of the poems, I call it like an unreality television show. But yeah, and so there are poems that are addressed directly to America, which was written just a few days into November of 2016. There are others where I'm looking at and considering the political situation throughout those years, including the pandemic years. There's also a section of poems, and in fact, the book begins with a section of poems that are more specifically around issues of environment and workers' rights in Appalachia. So it's the book starts in some ways it starts regionally within my own home place of Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and then moves into looking more specifically at Cincinnati, where I live now, and then into the country as a whole.
Please read us another poem.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Okay, you get to choose. Do you want Appalachia or America?
One of each.
Okay, one of each. That sounds wonderful. Since I mentioned my mother in the previous poem, here's a poem that was written during her final years with dementia, but also looking at the grief of the societal changes based on the presidential election. It's called On Grief, November 2016. 1. The sixth stage of grief is meaning, says the man who ought to know, the one up at the death and dying podium who flies around the country fueled by our tears. I like this guy. He says no matter how rich the meaning, it is never worth the cost. But we're a meaning-making animal, that's me talking now, always searching for some reason, as if this unnatural disaster of a president-elect will turn out to be the push to the cliff edge this country needed, or maybe it's how Mary meets Bob or Barb or Miguel at the No Trump March, and the kid they'll raise will cure dementia someday, but too late for my mother or Ronald Reagan or our country, and maybe for me if Mom has the kind that runs in the family after all. 2. Back at the nursing home, the shriveled lady whose dementia is resting a step or two before my mom's looks over the table at us as my fingers slip some bits of fruit between my mother's lips and asks, "Who has your heart?" I'd say it's pretty obvious, which maybe is her point or maybe not. My mother doesn't have my heart, not literally, but I read on the internet, therefore it must be true, that fetal cells remain inside the mother's body all her life. And so she may have me in her heart, or in her spleen, or a bit of me floating around her withering brain, which might explain how she can tell me sometimes what I had for dinner, or who just died, or that the apples we bought from the market aren't worth the cost. 3. The principles of grief work, the grief guy declares, are say goodbye to who they were, start new with whoever they are now. And my mother and I are doing pretty well, at least today, with our commingling cells, but I don't think I will be making nice with the country we're about to get. It's bedtime for Bonzo all over again, except without directors or a script, and the contract on America has been renewed, this time as unreality television. The last TV show I really liked was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, from way back when the other Clinton was in office. I know I'm not the only one. Just last week, I saw a rusting Toyota with the bumper sticker, "What would Buffy do?" She'd kick some ass, that's what. I'm going to stick with anger, stage 2.
I never watched Buffy, but I love the poem.
Thank you.
Another thing that I love about this book is how wonderfully it's produced. Shadeland House Modern Press.
Yeah.
They do beautiful job with the production of the books.
Yeah, and that's Virginia Underwood, local to the Kentucky and Lexington area, although she publishes people from, a much wider swath. She does do a wonderful job, and I think I'm very grateful that she chose this book, because I think the production value is great, and she's also just someone who really cares about her poets and about the world.
What about those pages that when I first encountered them, like, whoa, is there something wrong with my book? Because they look
like they've been water damaged.
Yeah, soiled.
Yeah.
Mold.
Yes, so she chose, or her designer chose that particular motif because there is a section of the book that deals with the 2022 floods in eastern Kentucky. And so she saw this as being a way to kind of bring that sense of what has been damaged, in this case, in those poems very specifically by the flood, but also I think the poems really do talk about what has been damaged and yet what we still save.
You teach a lot of workshops and classes. What kind of topics do you like to cover?
These days I'm primarily teaching poetry, although I am actually also teaching a memoir class, which has been part of my work as a teacher, and also retreats for women to come and write and explore their own lives. With poetry, I have a couple of ongoing classes, and that happen both in the spring and the fall, and I find that much of my work, my own writing, actually happens during those times when I have a community of writers that I'm working with. And so I always say to myself that I have to be really good at choosing prompts and topics, because if I'm going to write, that's what I'll be focusing on. So it's a mix, I think, of a focus on craft and then also a focus on theme as a way to kind of get people writing. I've been really interested lately in poems that speak to each other, so poetic series, poetic sequences, and finding ways to continue to delve into the same subject matter, but to do it in a variety of fresh ways. And so that's probably what I'll be focusing on in my fall series.
Your students love you. And that's not a question, I've seen it.
Yeah, no, I love my students, and we're friends. It is that when you're an adult teaching adults, there is a lot of fluidity around those kinds of relationships. And I might, find myself a student in the class of one of my students, and they find themselves, taking my workshops because they're interested in it. We're just, we're a community of writers. Like you have helped to develop here in the Lexington area. I've admired your work here for so many years.
Thank you. I love my students too.
Yeah, I know you do, and they love you. In fact, we have some of the same students.
We do have some of the same students, yeah. There are so many people who want to learn and who want to try working with various teachers. And right now my ears perked up when you said memoir class, and I'm like, oh, I wonder if I can sign up. So there is bounty of friendships and community and literary goodness in the region, and I feel so fortunate to be part of it.
Yeah, as do I.
And what are you working on now?
So in addition to teaching, I am working on a new collection of poems and prose, which again in the overachiever category, which basically traces American and Appalachian history from the early 1600s into the present day, using my own maternal line as the particular lens through which these centuries are explored. My 10th great grandmother was a Jamestown bride, sent over by the Virginia Company before there was the United States of America, to be looking at it one way, to be sold off to the highest bidder for tobacco
What is
leaves.
Jamestown bride? I'm sorry that I don't know.
No, that's fine. So Jamestown was the first continuous colony in what became the United States. Jamestown, Virginia, was settled in the early 1600s by white English settlers. And during the early years, there was a number of ways that the Englishmen, and believe me, they were all men, the Englishmen who set up the colony made money from having kind of created this actually not colony at that point, this community, by selling tobacco and selling shares of tobacco and shares of land. But one of the things that they did, because it was mostly men who were the settlers, the white settlers of this region, they recruited women who would be willing to make the travel from England to the Americas to be wed in exchange for 150 pounds of tobacco leaves. And so that's how my grandmother got here, and that's how that family was started. 10th great grandfather had come over as an indentured blacksmith. So how he raised the money for the bride prize, I'm not, no one really knows. We're talking 400 years ago, but that's how we began. And so it was just an interesting, for me it was an interesting story, sort of looking at issues of gender and class, and of course race and colonization, and in the late 1700s, after the Revolutionary War, the family made their way into the Appalachian Mountains, and so became part of that story of how the Appalachian Mountains were settled by white people. So it struck both my imagination, but also my curiosity as someone who is interested in these broader issues, both within the region and within the country.
So are you writing them in persona poems, or?
No, it's a mix. I mean, there are a few persona poems, but primarily they are poems that are from my point of view. As an uneasy descendant looking back at the history of the family. Some poems are directly about the family and about that history. Other poems are about what was happening on America and in the United States once it became the United States, and in Appalachia, during those times. So sort of placing these individuals within that larger context. I have committed myself to writing at least one poem for each grandmother. So I really want for this to be a book of poems and prose. I mean, it's woven together, but poems especially that are looking at this history from the women's perspective, which is very difficult to do because the women stories are not told. And as far as I can tell, my mother is probably the first of the women in that particular family to even be literate. Mm. So, someone said to me, "Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if you found letters that they wrote?"
Journal entries,
they're not going to be there. They're not going to be there. So I have to do the research and also use my imagination.
What kind of research can you do?
There's quite a bit of research that about those early days. About I'm able to find more information about my 10th great grandmother, who was born in 1599, than I am about my first great grandmother, who was born in the late 1800s, because since she was one of the few white women in Virginia, she just keeps showing up in various
She stood
places.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know what she left her family in the will. I know she was a midwife. I know that she killed an Indian with his gun, scrabbling over his gun. I mean, all of these things just kind of show up, and there's no stories about them, but it's like, wow, this is strange and interesting and alarming in some cases. So there's some things that I can find in that way. And then, of course, genealogy has gotten so popular these days. There are also ways of locating things like census material and birth certificates and death certificates and land sales, those sorts of things.
Do you want to share some poems from the project?
Sure, I'd be happy. I would love to. I was hoping you'd ask. So, and this is still a manuscript in progress. So it will be at least a couple of years before this sees the light of day as a book. But I am sending poems out into the world, and this poem, in fact, was published by Still, the journal, which is an online journal. It's called Facts About the Grandmothers, and it's from Margaret to Etta, 1596 to 1991. Facts About the Grandmothers. One granny was a granny woman along the York River, tending after birth in 1646 to one whose water scalded her. One granny came unbidden to my birth in 1959 to tend her daughter at the breaking of her water, only to see her swept away behind cold metal doors. Most grannies raised the next of them along the banks of hungry rivers. They died of cancer, consumption, causes unknown. They outlived husbands, children, died before they were grannies at all. They died with nothing, died with livestock, jewelry, servants, slaves. One granny willed to her grandchildren, another child's granny, another granny's child. 3 grannies left me photographs, each with sunken cheeks and unreadable eyes. I have no words writ with a granny's hand. A mark upon the page, I X ye sign. One granny snored beside me in her feather bed, her Indian hair unleashed from its Pentecostal coil. One granny shot an Indian with his own gun. 4 pairs of grannies shared each other's names. One granny gave me hers and combed her fingers through my feathery curls. I have laid my hands on stones above 4 grannies' bones. 3 grannies, more, lie beneath salt water's rising tide. 2 grannies, mother, daughter, lay beneath the same man's husband, father, grunt and thrust, pushed from their bodies that same man's sons. Some grannies, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, not even a name.
Wow. This is so compassionate and emotional.
Thank you. Yeah, and I find myself, really feeling this emotional tie with these grandmothers, and particularly the later ones, in southwestern Virginia, where I feel like I can imagine a little bit more of their lives. But even trying to imagine a woman in her 50s making the trek from Delaware to North Carolina, what that must have been like in the late 1700s to be at the really toward the end of her life, because she didn't live a whole lot longer after arriving in North Carolina, to make those hundreds of miles, and why would you do that? You know, it's like that curiosity.
Maybe she didn't have a choice, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, she may not have. I mean, she wouldn't have had the choice. Her husband would have had the choice. But even that, it's like, why would he do that? You know, at that point in his life, because he would have been even a little bit older than her. You know, to make that trek. You know what that must have been like for those families, which then, you know, kind of brings us into the whole migration story of you know, even beyond the Appalachian migration of why we move, what you know, it connects with your book, you know, your most recent book of why, what we're looking for, what we find, what the difference is between those two, and how, you know, cultures and communities are formed and reformed by these sorts of movements across land.
We have time for another poem, and it would be wonderful if you read us a poem from your new book.
Thank you. I would love to. This poem, you had asked previously, or we talked previously about sort of the flood-ravaged pages that the designer created. And so I'm going to read a poem that is about the 2022 flooding in southeastern Kentucky. And I'll just say as a preface to it that this entire poem is written from Facebook posts of people directly affected by the floods, and were posts that were made the day following the night of the flood, so in July 2022. Aerial view of catastrophic flooding in eastern Kentucky. Quicksand, Bulin, Neon, Heiner, Martin, Feisty. This is our place in Hueysville. This was my mother's house before she passed. Samantha's sister's house is by that blue bridge. Anyone know anything about Fugate's Fork Road? Stringtown, Ajax, Isom, Pinetop, Dwarf. This is my cousin's house. My mama's house is on the left. That bridge is about 8 feet above where the creek used to be. Isn't this Mary's house? This is the mouth of our holler. The red arrow was our road in. Nick's branch, Jake's branch, Trot. If you zoom in to where the white car hood is, my home is there. Rowdy, Wayland, Noble's Landing, Cowan Creek. Oh my God, that is Pigeon Roost. Hindman, Buckhorn, Chavis, Krypton, Garrett, over toward Pound. Y'all, this is my hometown. This little tree and God kept us alive this morning. My daughter swam with her dog to a neighboring rooftop. Does anyone know about Kite, Kentucky? Caney, Possum, Airy, Lost Creek, Hardburley, Trace. Dad and my nephew are neck deep. They need help, please. Are you all safe? We lost the farm animals and 5 cats. Lost my chainsaws, so I can't even work. You need to understand the nature of the topography. Add to that strip mining, climate change, political neglect. We have lost everything again. We have warm beds, clothes, and toiletries available. We have hot showers and food. Anyone trapped in downtown Whitesburg is welcome to come. We need help, and I'm willing to help anyone in the same shape we are. Your prayers are good, but we need to get federal and state assistance ASAP. Don't cry for Appalachia. Work for change however you can. Let's use the internet to tell our story. Thank you for posting. Much love and many blessings to you all from what's left.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you.
What is the most important thing you teach your students? If there is one thing you want them to remember from your class, what is it?
I think that the most important thing is, for me as a writer, and then also as a teacher of writing, is always finding that balance between authenticity of voice and curiosity. the willingness to both be yourself and your most authentic self and who you are, and write from your own material, but also to be curious about what all the various possibilities might be for that authenticity, because I think it's, I think there can be a tendency to go and sort of go back and forth in either direction, to either say, this is me and this is my subject matter and I'm sticking with it, which is fine, on a certain level, or to say, I need to be writing new things all the time, and I need to write like that person, or I need to explore this way. And I think it really is just always, always kind of letting that needle kind of move back and forth and finding the right balance for yourself at any particular time, to not shut yourself off, but at the same time to keep being yourself.
Thank you so much, Pauletta. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you, Katerina. I always love to speak with you.